So this is a real question. Which side will win? No cost or very low cost machine translation like Google Translate. You've probably all tried it out. Or paid human translation. This is a very lively question. Just in the last couple of weeks, a big player in this area published an article predicting that their machine translation system can produce high-quality translation, and there is no need for a human in the loop. In other words, predicted the demise of human translators. So what do you think? Which side will win? Well, first, let's make sure we understand the question. The question is, which method of production will be used? Unedited machine translation or human translation? Once you train an artificial intelligence machine translation system trained with human translations, many human translations. So humans are involved in the training because we use their translations. But once it's trained, you give a new source text to the system and out pops a machine translation almost instantly and at almost no additional cost once the system has been trained. With unedited machine translation, it means that once the system is trained and a new source text is presented, there's no human involvement at all. No editing, no checking, just to make sure things are okay. No human is involved until it goes to the end user. That's unedited machine translation. Human translation in this dichotomy is everything else. Machine translation can be used, or not, as a starting point, or on certain sentences. It's up to the human. And the human takes responsibility for the final result. So we used to divide it into post-edited machine translation and humans using CAT tools or computer-aided translation and traditional human translation, but that distinction is becoming very blurry. So we now believe that the best way to divide it up is just two ways: unedited machine translation or human translation. Now, there is a big difference in cost. The incremental cost for the next translation in unedited machine translation is almost zero. The incremental cost when you present a new source text for human translation is substantial. It's a human activity, very skilled human activity. And yes, there is a big difference in cost. So, which side will win? For some people, such as my colleague, I spoke of at the beginning, it's obvious that machine translation will win, and there will soon be no more human translators. For others, including myself, I am biased. I am the vice president of the International Federation of Translators, so I do have a certain responsibility here, but I also believe in what I'm doing. And I'll tell you that I believe strongly that there will be human translators for a very long time. So, which side will win? I suggest to you this is very much the wrong question to ask. So let's look at some alternative questions. The first alternative question is, when should I use unedited machine translation, and when should I use human translation? Now, so it's not who wins, it's when you use one and when you use the other. So the question is not that humans are against machine translation. Human translators sometimes use machine translation, sometimes don't, but they're in control. That's the key question. Who's in control? Now, a simple, very simple rule that you might think is pro-machine, but I say is pro-human, is whenever it's feasible to use unedited machine translation, use it. And when it's not feasible or advisable, then hire a human translator. Why is that pro-human? Because on a given day, of the material that needs to be translated and is used, well over 90% is done with unedited machine translation. There are not nearly enough professional human translators to take care of all the translation needs in the world. That percentage of what is unedited machine translation will probably go from 90%, 95%, 99%, and still the portion for which we use human translators is almost too much for the human translators to handle. So sure, we're glad when it works. Go ahead and use unedited machine translation. Now, what are some of the factors involved? Another question is, how do you make this decision, a good decision, between unedited machine translation and human translation? Here are some of the factors. The type of linguistic service that you require. Localization, transcreation, summary translation, audio-visual translation, or conventional translation. Now, if you're wondering what those are, the International Federation of Translators, FIT, has very recently published a position paper on these different types of translation, how to define them, how to distinguish among them. And you're welcome to go to the FIT website, which is FIT, FIT-IFT, for Fédération Internationale des Traducteurs, International Federation of Translators.org. Go to the publications section, and there you'll see the position papers in a number of areas, including the position paper that defines these different types of linguistic service. Another very important criterion is whether your translation needs to be source-oriented or target-oriented. There is no right and wrong here. A source-oriented translation sticks very close to the source text. And that's needed in some areas, such as in legal work. You don't want to depart too much from what the person who was making a deposition said and say, well, we'll make him sound a little better. We'll change a little bit what he said or she said. No, that doesn't work at all. In intelligence work, it has to be very source-oriented. In marketing, very target-oriented. And in literature, if any of you know about Venuti, there's an argument for sometimes literary translation to be more source-oriented or more target-oriented. It's a decision. It's an important decision. And then the question of translation grades. Now this you may not have heard of, even if you're in translation. Let's just take a minute for this. What are translation grades? Translation grades are used across industries, in many industries. For example, you go to the store and you buy a drill, an electric drill. You might have a choice between a consumer grade drill and a professional grade drill. Now, the consumer grade drill is for a hobbyist who just uses it a few minutes at a time, once in a while. The professional grade is much more heavy duty. You'll be able to use it all day long without it overheating. It is more resistant to shock, all kinds of things. Now, is a consumer grade drill a bad drill in some absolute sense? No, it's appropriate for, that grade is appropriate for a given set of purposes, a given set of use cases. So grades are not about what is good or bad, it's about a cluster of use cases, and you match the use case, the purpose, with the product. In translation, we're just introducing the notion of translation grades in the industry, in the profession, in the sector. Now, we could spend quite a bit of time, and maybe there'll be questions about it, about the question of how you define the grades. We're currently proposing 3 grades, high, medium, and low, and it's based on use cases and risk tolerance, and it's defined in terms of tolerance for errors of 2 kinds, correspondence errors and fluency errors. Now, correspondence errors are correspondence between the source and the target text, and they would include accuracy errors, which are traditionally called accuracy errors, and terminology errors in terms of, say, the MQM error typology. They would also include stylistic errors. If you don't follow the guide, well, there are different questions. Actually, style can also be associated with fluency. And so, but locale convention errors, there's a whole typology of errors. And at the highest level, when you're just looking at 2 types, you look at correspondence and fluency. Fluency is how well the target text reads on its own, regardless of whether it is a translation or an original text. Now, the translation grades are very closely related to risk analysis. You must conduct a risk analysis before you select a grade. What is the risk of errors of correspondence? What is the risk of errors in fluency or lack of fluency? What kind of damage could be caused to people, to equipment, to an organization's reputation if there are errors? And then, of course, what are the consequences? Could you lose money? Could you be sued? And these are important factors in selecting a grade. Now, good business says, well, select the lowest grade that is applicable to your use case. And that's fine. Translators who really think about it, who know that they're professionals, should say, sure, if you don't need high-grade translation, if you don't need my services, go ahead and use machine translation. But keep that risk tolerance in mind. Now, what's the elephant in the room? The obvious question for this conference. Can AI-based machine translation, the current system, it uses machine learning, uses deep learning on existing human translations, is it consistently capable of producing high-grade translation? I think the answer is very clear. No, absolutely not. Sometimes you'll get a very good degree of correspondence, and then sometimes you'll get what even people in the field of machine translation call hallucinations, where the machine translation will produce just crazy little things there's no connection between the source text and the target text for that part of that sentence. Where did that come from? Well, nobody knows. That's why they call it a hallucination. And you cannot ask the machine translation system why it made that error. It's a black box. That's a problem. So I'm saying not currently. So you must then look at, if you need high-grade translation, you probably need a professional translator. I would say definitely need a professional translator. But if low-grade translation meets your needs, fine, go for it. Use unedited machine translation. Now, this raises a very important question for the audience here at this conference. Where should we put our effort? Should we put our effort into developing new types of machine translation that can produce higher grades so that ultimately we can produce high-grade translation consistently with unedited machine translation? Should that be our objective? Or should our objective be to help the human translator work better using machine translation when appropriate in a kind of a symbiotic way? Well, those are 2 very different areas in which we can put our effort. I'm going to suggest that one answer to this is the work called the Turing Trap by Professor Bernjolfsson at Stanford University. He's been writing on this for a while. He says, if you look at the big picture of society, economics, technology, it's not obvious that everyone should be working to eliminate humans in all areas and all applications of artificial intelligence. And although his article is not at all about machine translation, I believe that it directly applies. There's a movement within the translation sector called augmented translation. What is being augmented? It's the human that's being augmented, not the machine, not putting more effort into the machine translation system to make it better, but putting more effort into how the human can more effectively use the various tools, terminology lookup, translation memory lookup, machine translation, and other tools to produce a more effective translation. Well, I encourage you to look at this and see what you think. I think his argument is very convincing, that we might all be better off in various areas, including machine translation or translation in general, to attempt to augment the human translator and use artificial intelligence as one of those tools. Now, what are some additional factors when you are choosing between unedited machine translation and human translation, these two methods of production? Purpose and intended audience of the translation. Hugely important. Why are you doing the translation in the first place? Why did you request it? And who is the intended audience? What are they going to do with it? Then there's the question of the source and target languages. Well, how many languages are there in the world? Well, depends on how you make the division between language and dialect. But there are probably 4,000 or 5,000 languages in the world. For how many of those languages is there sufficient training data? Just in other presentations, we've talked about the importance of training data. Existing human translations, which are high grade, you want to train with high grade translation. In how many of those languages do you have sufficient training data to properly train a machine translation system? Well under 1% of the languages in the world. Think about that for a minute. We're so biased toward the major languages. Well, the United Nations had a year of indigenous languages a few years ago, and the work was so important and unfinished that it has declared now, starting this year, the decade of indigenous languages. The United Nations General Assembly voted for that. FIT is part of that. Many organizations are part of that, and we want to help deal with translation needs in some of these many languages where there is very little training data. In some, there's no training data because they're not even written languages. They don't have to become written languages. Maybe we'll have interpreters for them. So another question is the properties of the source content. Now here, this is a very important question. It's not easy to explain in a few minutes, but there's a distinction called general language and domain-specific language. At a simple level, it's very, very easy to explain. If it's terminology for a particular technical domain, that's domain-specific. And if it's just what everybody understands who knows that language at all, it's general language. But that's not enough. Is it frozen or dynamic? If it's technical language, domain-specific and frozen, that's the easiest for machines to deal with, of course, because it's consistent. Over time, The same term in the source text goes to the same term in the target text. But sometimes there are new terms even in a domain as the domain evolves. And term formation is a whole discipline within translation and terminology management and terminology theory. Dynamic can apply to both general language and domain-specific language. So just take the term greenwashing. Oh, there's some greenwashing going on here. Well, it was only a few months ago, I'm behind the times, only a few months ago that I started seeing this term more frequently and said, well, what does this mean? I don't think it has anything to do with the way you're with washing off the color or painting, and it turns out to be a misleading type of advertising where you present your company as being ecologically friendly or green, and you wash what you're really doing, kind of cover it up and make it sound green. Now, that's a new term. It was just in the last few years. Well, what if that appeared in a text for a machine translation system? The current technology is not at all able to deal with dynamic language. But humans are. Now, there are also constraints on syntax, the structure of the sentence, semantics. To my delight, this has been mentioned several times today and yesterday, that artificial intelligence systems, generally speaking, do not deal with semantics at all. And especially in the case of machine translation, there is nothing about semantics. It deals only with context, the immediate surrounding words. It doesn't even try to develop concepts. So, and then pragmatics goes beyond semantics and deals with connections with the real world. It was a very interesting presentation yesterday about how children learn language. And there we had the triangle of the symbol, the concept in your mind, and the real world object, and how they relate. And there was a reference to Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, whom I've studied, and Wittgenstein, famous philosopher, and this triangle is very important. Well, current machine translation doesn't deal with anything but one corner of that triangle, just the actual symbol. Pragmatics involves going well beyond the symbol, going into the real world, the connection between the symbol, what's in your mind, the symbol on paper or screen, whatever, what's in your mind, and what's in the real world, and how they all relate to each other. And it's not straightforward. So, what are some additional factors? Well, some additional factors are another presentation that will be tomorrow, and by Pascale Elbaz. And she's actually in the audience if you want to ask her about hers. And when it is, it's in the program, Elbaz. There are two Elbaz. One is about astrophysics and one is about translation. So now we come to some philosophical questions. For me, this is the most exciting aspect, and I would love to pursue this with any of you who feel so inclined. But the first question is, what is context? I have an article about context that I published a few years ago, going well beyond context, or the surrounding words. What is meaning? Where does it reside? A very important question throughout my career. Is the AI used in machine translation currently intelligent? I would say definitely not even close. Is it necessary to understand language to produce high-grade translation? I would say definitely yes. To produce low-grade translation, no. High-grade translation, yes. It's necessary to understand the source text. And then, if you're into the philosophy of Levinas and others who talk about the other, then you get into the difference between the saying and the said. Here, you get beyond what can even be translated, where you get into human interaction and relating to another person as a human. Ultimately, not everything can be translated or even written. And some of the most important aspects of human life cannot be written down without losing something, because they are living the saying, the act of interacting, not what was said, but what you are saying right now. And I believe that we need to make sure we don't lose the saying or the capability of engaging in the saying. So, how important are the following? Ambiguity, cultural diversity, and beauty. I would claim that if we went only to frozen language in hopes of having better machine translation, and we had truly unambiguous language, that would become the ultimate prison for the human mind. And we could talk about that, if you wish. Cultural diversity. If we only go to domain-specific language in hopes of improving machine translation, we lose a lot. We tend to lose cultural diversity. We try to make all cultures in the world, or at least some cultures, closer to each other and ignore the fundamental differences in cultural viewpoint. Those nuances are important to human life. They're not important to the computer. They're important to us. And finally, beauty. What's the role of beauty in language and in translation? For low-grade translation, it's not beautiful, and that's okay. But high-grade translation, sometimes you need it to be beautiful. And so, in conclusion, which side wins? Well, I've answered the question. Neither side wins. It's the wrong question. The question is, when do you use one and when do you use the other? And to summarize it, you automate and use unedited machine translation when low-grade translation is sufficient. You augment humans and human translators when high or medium translation is needed. And you label all translation. This is something that we're just starting to promote. All translation, we believe, those of us on this team, should be labeled. When you see it, there should be something in the corner, a little icon that says it's unedited machine translation or human translation. Why? Because you are consuming that translation, and you have a consumer right to know what you are consuming, just like you have the right to know if the water you're drinking is pure, or the food you're eating, or the material you're using contains lead or other dangerous materials. So the question is, and by the way, you can find out more about grades and labels by going to the Tranquality website, tranquality.info. There are others, there are tranquality.org and others, but Tranquality, for translation quality.info, has a brand new page about translation grades and labels, which will be added to. But my bottom line is, how much importance do you place on people, as opposed to machines, freedom of expression to come up with new ideas, and linguistic beauty? I invite you to think about those questions. And that concludes my presentation, and if you want to interact about this, my email address is up there at the top. I hope to leave some time for questions. Yes, have I left enough time? Good.
So, on va donner une bonne main d'applaudissement à Alain. Alain?
This question is a little bit more about like your experience, like maybe even during this conference. Like I know you can see that there's like this translation that goes live, the transcription, the machine translation, which is completely, I think, so interesting that it's like coinciding with your presentation. I would just want to know, like, kind of, what's kind of your thoughts on like this kind of technology being used for, like, for example, like these conferences here, or like, what's your thought about this? Like, how has your experience been witnessing this? Like, you're fluent also in French, so have you seen, what are your thoughts? I'm interested.
Well, relating to the previous presentation about legal work, I wasn't here for the whole thing, but instead of trying to predict what the judge will say or what the jury will say, one use of low-grade translation is to do what we call triage, which is a French word borrowed into English. It's used in medicine, where you decide which patients you're going to treat first, closest to death or bleeding or whatever. Well, it applies to translation. Say you have 500 documents that might be relevant to the court case. What's a good use of low-grade translation? Use a low-grade translation, automatic translation for all 500, and have somebody look at they don't necessarily speak the source language, right? Look at the translations quickly and say, oh, well, now I can see these 12 documents out of 500 are the most relevant. Then send them and get a high-grade translation. That is so much more efficient than either trying to have the machine make the selection, where it will make serious errors, or have high-grade translation for all of them. This is done every day in the European Commission. People can get documents in any of the 24 languages, and they probably only speak 2 or 3 of them. If it's in one they don't speak, they will often request a low-grade translation. It comes back within a few minutes, and then they can decide if it's relevant. It's good enough for gisting. For it to be low-grade, it has to be good enough for gisting. Sometimes machine translation is not even low-grade. It's below low-grade. It has to be good enough to support accurate triage. But often it can. And then the whole thing becomes more efficient, and the human makes the final judgments. So I've seen this in several, all through this conference, which I was pleasantly surprised to see references to confidence, trustworthiness, and this is a big issue in artificial intelligence. I didn't realize that this is basically the question of grades. Can you trust the machine not to have what one of my colleagues calls poison cookies? Little here and there, you've got a whole bunch of nice cookies coming out, nice sentences, but once in a while a poison one. And you can't predict how many poison cookies there will be per 1,000 sentences, but you know there are going to be some. And this is actually the same problem in many applications of artificial intelligence. Confidence, trust, how to actually estimate the errors, and what are the consequences of those occasional errors. I feel after yesterday and today, I feel that that translation has much more in common with other applications of artificial intelligence than I did before I arrived. I hope that addresses your question.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm actually curious about your thoughts on the fact that so many people in AI seem to think that the problem of machine translation is quote-unquote solved, when for people with even a little knowledge in translation in general, or linguistics, or machine translation even, this is patently not the case. Like, how do you feel about that?
It is so painful to read, for somebody in my position, to read an article that claims it's called parity. Claimed parity between human translation and machine translation. Microsoft made the first claim, and there have been very serious scholars who are not professional translators who have debunked the claims. The experiment was not set up properly. It was set up for essentially with the judging was not properly done. The type of source content was easy to translate. And there's, in summary, I've devised what's called the translation Turing test. And I first came up with this idea in 2012. I've been refining it. And it's a way to properly test whether a machine translation system has achieved what a human can do. And if you're interested, actually, I'll post this and some others articles to a page on a website called ttt.org, and we're starting a page, ttt.org/timeworld2022, and including that, I'll add that article about the translation Turing test, which in great detail shows how you could ask that question properly. I know that's only a partial answer, but afterwards I'd be glad to take give you my card and you can get a copy of that article.
For sure. Thank you.
And then there was one more question here.
So, coming.
My question is basically we saw in like the early 2000s to the mid 2000s like a huge jump between the old like Babelfish, the word for word translation to AI translation, which is much better. Looking forward, how many more breakthroughs on that scale do you think we need before we get to the point where we have actual parity?
Well, that's a great question. Going from rule-based machine translation to SMT, statistical machine translation, to neural machine translation, a great advance at each stage. I think that I predict, and I stake my reputation on this, that neural machine translation, the current methodology, the current technology, is plateauing and will not continue to get better and better in terms of correspondence and fluency. The fluency is excellent because it simply uses human translations and it puts out what humans do. But it doesn't have that understanding. I don't think there's any straightforward path from the current technology to the next step that would avoid these hallucinations and occasional poison cookies. Some of you may have heard about Ray Kurzweil's singularity. Well, I've read The Singularity is Near. I've read it twice. And I believe that if the singularity arrives, that's when computers become better than humans at every intellectual task, and continue to get much better, much faster after that. If that happens, human translators will be replaced, but also everybody else will be replaced. Tell me your profession. You're a doctor? Oh, you'll be replaced. You're an attorney? Oh, you will be replaced. And I think that professional human translators will be in that group of professions that will be the very last to be replaced before the singularity. And you can quote me on that.